This is going to be a sort of quick and dirty introduction to the Middle Ages, at least to those aspects of that time period that directly concern us. The overall project or spirit of medieval philosophy, the person of Thomas Aquinas, whose ideas we're going to study, and then finally C.S. Lewis, who's a modern writer, not medieval, but he's a modern writer who takes Thomas's ideas and kind of translates them into a more reader-friendly way of writing. You may want to print out the PowerPoint from Blackboard. It's posted under finished presentations before you begin. And take notes. There will be a journal entry at the end. There will also be a few quiz questions on the content of this presentation added to the quiz on C.S. Lewis that you will complete in Blackboard before seminar. The image on this screen contains 2 verses from a medieval prayer book. The verses say, "God, come to my assistance. Lord, make haste to help me." That already kind of conveys part of the spirit of medieval philosophy in that it was very, very deeply intertwined with Christian faith. Medieval writers and speakers would often begin their books or their sermons or lectures with a prayer addressed to God, asking for God's help and giving them something valuable to say. So I will begin with the same idea. Here's our outline of the history of Western philosophy, kind of like a highlight show we're studying. We've studied writers from the ancient world, Greek and Roman, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Marcus Aurelius. Now we're moving into the Middle Ages. We'll stop there briefly before moving on to the modern world. What was the turning point between the ancient and medieval worlds? Different historians will point to different dates and different causes, but most historians generally say that the end of the ancient world was the collapse of the Roman Empire and the rise of feudalism in Europe. As you know, Marcus Aurelius' son Commodus screwed things up royally for Rome, and the Roman Empire kind of declined from there, was taken over by European barbarians, as the Romans called them. And this led to a great deal of chaos in Europe in the Middle Ages. And the chaos led to kind of the rise of monasteries, which became mini fortresses and centers of learning. Just as we can look to the Parthenon as a symbol of the ancient world, to a Roman aqueduct with its sturdiness and function as a symbol of ancient Roman philosophy, we could look to an image of a Gothic cathedral as a symbol of the Middle Ages, with its Christian focus, but also with its efforts to harmonize and to balance so many different elements. This map just gives us kind of an indication of the geographical area that we're looking at. We cross the Atlantic Ocean and go to Spain, France, the United Kingdom, and Italy for the center of, or the focus of the place that we're studying. This is just a brief comparison with where we were in the ancient world. North Africa, Asia Minor, present-day Turkey, and the Grecian Peninsula and the coast of Italy is where most of our ancient philosophers were from, but now we're moving again into Western and Northern Europe. It may be fair to say that in the Middle Ages, Christian faith became the decisive influence in society, in politics, in culture, and in philosophy. This image kind of captures or expresses the relationship between religion and politics, or the church and politics in the Middle Ages. A historical turning point was the year 800, when Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, was established as the emperor of the so-called Holy Roman Empire. This elimination from a manuscript shows him being crowned by the Pope. In the Middle Ages, there was this idea that God gave kings their authority. Then that was symbolized in a coronation ceremony where the Pope, a Christian leader, would place a crown on the head of the king. So it may be fair to say that the project of medieval philosophy, in a sense, was bringing together religious faith and reason, scientific reason if you wish, into a unified structure of thought. This effort to pull together the elements that are so important in Christian belief with philosophical ideas that are rational, that don't have a religious basis, pull them all together into one superb architecture that's completely balanced, that certainly was the project of Thomas Aquinas. In the early Middle Ages, when things were rather chaotic, monasteries became centers of learning. Monasteries are communities of men or women who dedicate themselves in a special way to trying to follow Jesus' gospel lifestyle. They take a vow of poverty, chastity, and obedience. And in the Middle Ages, monasteries were constructed kind of like fortresses. This is a drawing of the monastery at Monte Cassino in Italy. You can see how it's on the top of a hill, easily defendable, surrounded by a thick wall. Monks would grow their own food and sometimes make products to sell, like wine and cheese, and they would devote themselves to lives of prayer and study. And so monks preserved much of the learning of the ancient world. If it weren't for monks and their monasteries, we would have lost much of the science, math, literature, and philosophy that ancient Greek and Rome gave the world. The way monks preserved literature was by copying manuscripts. Of course, back in the day, before typewriters, word processors, all the technology we have now, the only way to preserve a book was to copy it. Marcus Aurelius's Meditations was sort of preserved by a thread. There's one existing complete copy, as far as I know, of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, and it's in the Vatican Library in Rome. The Vatican is kind of the global headquarters of the Catholic Church. It was probably preserved, perhaps, by medieval monks who laboriously copied manuscripts by hand. So their whole lives would be caught up with prayer, with working in their gardens and their kitchens and whatever else they did, and with spending their time copying manuscripts. So they copied them by hand and illustrated them with illuminations, pictures and drawings in gold leaf. This is the same page from a prayer book called The Liturgy of the Hours that monks would use for their 7 times daily prayer. Saint Benedict, the founder of Western monasticism, is famous for his saying, "Ora et labora," pray and work, and that's pretty much what the monks did. In the High Middle Ages, around the 11 into 1200s, the centers of learning moved from the monasteries, which were pretty much in the countryside, into the cities. Cathedral schools in the cities like Paris became the great universities that we know today: Oxford, Cambridge, Paris, Munich. So sort of that sense of moving from a rural monastic setting into a more urban setting where scholars interacted more with what was going on in the world around them. The form of philosophy that arose in these cathedral schools is called scholastic philosophy. Thomas Aquinas is a scholastic philosopher or theologian. Their courses and their writing took the form of disputations or arguments, where students would take a position on both sides of a question, argue it out, and then the teacher would offer a response. Again, because of this style of thought, we could say that the whole project of medieval philosophy was bringing together faith and reason, which seemed to be arguing with each other or opposed to each other, into a unified structure of thought. It was definitely the project of scholastic philosophy. In addition to monks copying manuscripts in the West, in the East, in the Arab and Muslim world, which was just flourishing at the time, Arab philosophers preserved books, especially of Aristotle, and brought them into Europe in the 11 and 1200s. They translated Aristotle from Greek into Arabic, and then those Arabic works were translated into Latin. Medieval philosophers got a hold of them, and they were very, very challenging to Christian faith. There were many ideas in the books of Aristotle that Christians would really question or reject. His theory of the soul, his notion that the universe is eternal, which means there was no creation, no beginning of time. And so some of Aristotle's ideas presented challenges to Christian faith. There was some controversy within the church over whether people should be reading Aristotle's books in the university. Al-Ghazali, an Iranian-born philosopher and theologian, is just one example of an Arab philosopher who interacted with Aristotle. He accepted some of Aristotle's ideas, and he rejected others. So here's our good friend Thomas Aquinas, who lived in the 1300s. I never memorized the dates of philosophers' births and deaths, but I do remember that he lived in the 1200s or the 13th century, and he died in 1274, roughly at the age, I believe, of 49 or 50. He was young. There's some speculation on the part of historians that he was poisoned. He was on his way to a church council where the Western Church was trying to reunify itself with the Greek Orthodox Church, and a lot of people, for political reasons, did not want this. Thomas Aquinas and Bonaventure, another theologian at the time, wanted this to happen, and they both died around the time of this council, so there's speculation that maybe somebody did away with them for political reasons. But anyway, he was born into a noble family in Aquino, Italy. As the youngest of the family, he wasn't going to get much of an inheritance. So he was kind of raised in a monastery. That often happened in the Middle Ages, that wealthy families, instead of dividing their property among all of the sons, they'd send the youngest kid away to a monastery. So that was where he grew up. Probably learned his Latin there, learned to be a scholar. Maybe he did some copying of manuscripts when he got a little older. But supposedly he was called the dumb ox by his classmates as a boy. People didn't think he was very smart. Now he's known as the common doctor of the church. That just means everybody's teacher. Christians, especially Catholics, kind of look to Thomas Aquinas as the anchor of our thought. He brought together so many of ideas of Christian faith, Christian beliefs, and tried to make rational sense of them and put them into some kind of order. He was kind of the founder of what Christians today call systematic theology, because he created a system out of Christian beliefs. So he received his early education at a monastery, but then, at the age of 19, he ran away from his family and from the monastery to join a new movement within Catholicism called the Dominican Friars. They were kind of like the hippies of the Middle Ages. They literally followed the vow of poverty, gave up all their stuff, and went around preaching, trying to walk in the footsteps of Jesus. So he embraced this lifestyle of gospel poverty, and yet at the same time, part of what the Dominicans were trying to do was they were trying to reform the church. The clergy, like the religious leaders in Catholicism, had become really ignorant and really corrupt, and the Dominicans wanted to counteract this. So they would send their boys to the University of Paris and other great schools to be highly educated so that they could preach about Christian beliefs in an accurate and informed way instead of misleading people. So Thomas ended up at the University of Paris. He studied there and he later taught there. He got his master's degree in theology, but he studied the controversial books of Aristotle right at the moment when the church was trying to ban them. At the time, Aristotle could have been considered cutting-edge science. Today we know that many of his scientific ideas were wrong, but that his approach to the physical sciences, his methodology, was solid. So Thomas was reading these books and trying to figure out a way to balance the ideas of Aristotle with his Christian beliefs. So it might be fair to say that he tried to come up with a way of instead of saying, okay, we have to choose between religion and science, we have to choose between the Bible and Aristotle, he tried to bring them both together and make them coherent, to form a synthesis or kind of overarching system that brings together faith and philosophy. Once again, Thomas Aquinas could be said to represent that overall medieval project, you're not going to forget this, of bringing together faith and reason into a unified structure of thought. Thomas's last and, in the opinion of many people today, greatest work, which actually remained unfinished, was called the Summa Theologiae. The title kind of expresses what it was. He attempted to deal with absolutely every question you could think of within Christian theology. These are some examples of questions that he deals with in the Summa. Proofs for the existence of God, which of course a non-believer wouldn't buy, but it's just a way for Christians to make rational sense out of their faith. The question whether the created universe is eternal, that was one of Aristotle's ideas. Thomas came up with the notion that creation is not just this one-time act, this event that happened at the beginning of time. It's really God's ongoing creative relationship with the universe. Along with that, the notion of instrumental causality, which kind of helps believers rationalize the apparent tension between religion and science. Today people say, well, did God create the world, or is the Big Bang and evolution the way things came about? Thomas Aquinas' notion is that God creates through natural causes, so that God works through the laws of gravity, the laws of physics, the laws of chemistry to create the universe that we know it. He was also responsible for developing and advancing just war theory, developing the idea of what is the soul and how does it relate to the body, virtue, ethics, what does it mean to lead a good life, who is Jesus and why is he important, what are the sacraments for, baptism, confirmation, Eucharist, all these kind of crazy things Christians do, why do they make sense, why do we do those things? So we kind of tried to make sense out of Christian faith. His writing in his classroom would have taken the form of the disputed question. Again, students would debate the pros and cons of a particular issue. For example, is there a soul? They would quote authoritative sources to support their ideas, like the Bible or the Fathers of the Church or even Aristotle. But they would also use logical, rational arguments for their positions. When the students were done duking it out, the teacher would then give a response that would resolve the question and answer the arguments. This illumination from a medieval manuscript depicts a disputed question taking place. Students on one side would say yes, students on the other side would say no, and then the teacher, in this case a woman, interestingly, and she looks, well, her headdress kind of shows that she was probably a wealthy upper class woman, says, okay, here's the answer. So, our disputed question on the table for us in seminar is the natural law real? So first we have to understand what the natural law is. Thomas Aquinas addresses that. And then we have to ask the question, well, is it something real or is it a bunch of nonsense? These are just some Latin terminology associated with natural law theory that are actually still used today in the legal profession. The word lex means law, something you ought to do. The word jus means right, something you may do or have permission to do.